evening, everyone. Everybody hear me? Yeah? Okay. My name is Josh. I've been here a few times over the years, so some of you may remember me when we have met, but if we haven't met or you don't remember me, that's my name. I live in San Francisco, California. I've lived there since 2018, and so it's been a wild ride. It's been a fun few years. I grew up in Alabama originally. I lived in Atlanta before I moved to San Francisco. I recently turned 36, so the end of my 20s and all through my 30s, I've been in San Francisco with my wife, and that's where my two children have been born and raised thus far, so please pray for them. And it's a good to be here with you. I was in San Francisco this morning with the church there, and I had the opportunity by Mike's invitation to come and be here this evening because it was, a couple months ago, Mike's been organizing these get-togethers, these like occasions for some of us local preachers to spend some time with each other talking through some topic or some text. And it was just a couple months ago that Mike asked me to talk about the idea of evangelism in an urban place. And so I did that talk, and Mike said, all right, well, would you mind doing that before the group? And I said, I don't mind. Do you mind if I do it again? And he said, that'd be great. So here I am. So if you're wondering why I'm here tonight, that's the genesis of how I got here this evening. By no means am I an expert in what it is I'm here to facilitate some conversation in, but certainly I've had some experiences, and I can share with you some of the things that I've experienced and some of the things I've learned. And I don't imagine that I need to convince the people in this room tonight that sharing the gospel with the people around you, your friends, your family, your neighbors in this city is important. I think you know that. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time establishing the biblical, gospel-centric nature of that. But I would like to turn to one text in Acts chapter 17 to illustrate what evangelism can look like and maybe draw some applications both from that text and from my experience for you tonight. So in Acts chapter 17, Paul arrives in Athens, Greece, and beginning in verse 16, it says this: while Paul was waiting for them at Athens, his spirit was provoked within him as he saw that the city was full of idols. So he reasoned in the synagogue with the Jews and the devout persons, and in the marketplace every day with those who happened to be there. Some of the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers also conversed with him. And some said, "What does this babbler wish to say?" Others said, "He seems to be a preacher of foreign divinities," because he was preaching Jesus and the resurrection. And they took him and brought him to the Areopagus, saying, "May we know what this new teaching is that you are presenting? For you bring some strange things to our ears. We wish to know, therefore, what these things mean." Now all the Athenians and the foreigners who lived there would spend their time in nothing except telling or hearing something new. So Paul, standing in the midst of the Areopagus, said, "Men of Athens, I perceive that in every way you're very religious. For as I passed along and observed the worship, I found also an altar with this inscription, 'To the unknown God.' What therefore you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by man, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything. And he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling place, that they should seek God and perhaps feel their way toward him and find him. One of us, for in him we live and we move and we have our being, as even some of your own poets have said, for we are indeed his offspring. Being then God's offspring, we ought not to think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone, imaged, formed by the art and imagination of man. The times of ignorance God's overlooked, but now he commands all people everywhere to repent because he's fixed a day on which he will judge the world in righteousness by a man whom he's appointed. And of this he has given assurance to all by raising him. Now when they heard of the resurrection of the dead, some mocked, but others said, "We will hear you again about this." So Paul went out from their midst, but some of the men joined him and believed, among whom also were Dionysius the Areopagite, and a woman named Damaris, and others with them. I imagine for many in this room, this is not an unfamiliar reading. But what I wanted to do in reading this is think about what it is to engage in a multicultural, diverse, and maybe even foreign to you setting. Certainly, Paul didn't live here, right? He was traveling through. Maybe he had been before. Maybe he had some familiarity with the culture because he had been in places like it, but he had not been in this place, maybe. Did you notice the emphasis that the text puts in some of the details about how many different kinds of people are around? There's certainly some ethnic differences present, and there's also some like philosophies that differ that are present, right? Worldviews, even religious. You notice he's in a synagogue, and then otherwise he's in a marketplace. He even has people who are not necessarily religious that are listening, and so this is truly a mixed environment. As I mentioned before, I lived in Atlanta before I lived in San Francisco. Atlanta's a very different place from San Francisco. I don't know how many of you have been to both those places and spent any real amount of time in either one of those. But if you've been in both and you've had some real boots on the ground life in both those places, they're both cities, there's lots of people, there's some shared things, right? There's economy. People are people, so people are trying to accomplish the same sorts of things no matter where you go. But the culture's a little different. The language can be a little bit different. People's backgrounds can be a little bit different. I spent 5 years in Atlanta. I've been in San Francisco for 8 years now. And one of the phenomenons that I experienced in Atlanta as an early 20-something when I moved there and had just recently become married and was trying to do the work of an evangelist is I kept running into a particular type of person in Atlanta. What Kirby and I eventually started calling street prophets. And this type of person was a person who seemed sort of like pseudo-Christian. They always had some sort of revelation or message from God that they were sharing on the sidewalk, or maybe as you engaged wherever you were, it became apparent that that was sort of their persona. And it was often a bit unhinged, but it had sort of a recognizable biblical vocabulary to it, right? There was some touchstones in conversation. You were like, okay, like I know what that term, or I know what that idea, where that comes from. But they weren't using it the way that, you would suspect those words or that idea should be used. And so this was a recurring sort of experience in Atlanta. Now, maybe you've had experiences like that here in the Bay Area. You meet somebody, you start talking, and maybe this portrait, this vignette, fits an experience or something that you had. But when I say that, it seemed like every other person that I engaged with on the streets of Atlanta would fall into some version of this category. That's probably a little hyperbolic, but it's not far off of the truth. I have not had that experience in San Francisco. I can't speak to all the reasons why that is, but I can tell you that that is how it has been. And the reason I wanted to share that with you is it's a good illustration of the uniqueness of place. It's a good illustration that like what may work in one moment with one kind of person doesn't work necessarily in another moment, in another place with another kind of person. And it's a good illustration of what I think many refer to as like spiritual pluralism. There's some words that I'm going to share tonight that I think are helpful in the concept of thinking about evangelism that I'll try to define as I go along, because if you're like me, they're not phrases, they're not words that I'm thinking of really outside of this context. And so I don't always have the best working definitions of things. So I'll try to share those as I go along. But spiritual pluralism being that a place does not have religious or spiritual homogeneity, sameness. right? And you guys experience that here, right? Like as you talk to your neighbors, you've probably realized their religious or spiritual experiences, if they claim any, vary greatly from your own, right? That's one of the things about the Bay Area. It's a very diverse place, and so that's represented in the spiritual, religious experiences people have. A lot of us in this room right now have come from some of those places, right? Another thing that I think is important when we think about evangelism, and particularly in urban context, and I know San Jose is not San Francisco, but there's some overlap in this. And I hope that with what I'm saying tonight, you can kind of take what's applicable and use it. And if other things that I'm saying are too weird, they're too unique to the experiences I've had, you can just throw them out and you can use the parts of this that make sense. But I imagine you've probably had this experience too, that as you try to operate here as a Christian, as a disciple of Jesus, not only have you encountered spiritual pluralism, but you've probably encountered some level of institutional skepticism. That is to say, anything that resembles sort of an organization, a thing with a hierarchy, people push back on it, right? Maybe you've had that experience. In cities, Athens, San Francisco, maybe even San Jose, are places where there's a lot of spiritual pluralism, and maybe as a byproduct of that subculture, there's a lot of institutional skepticism. So when we think about, at least in terms of the conversation tonight, when we think about evangelism in urban settings, places, we're talking about places with a lot of density, a lot of people, but we're not just talking about numbers. We're talking about culture. And we're talking about the social currency that exists, not just in a place with a lot of people, but in places with lots of kinds of people. All right? I know you guys know that, probably. We all can see it every time we go to the grocery store, we come to church, we walk through our neighborhoods. We know this sort of inherently with where we live. But a few things that are worth observing up front as we get into some of the applications about this and we can have some conversation. In places where there's lots of us, high density places, we're not just talking about living shoulder to shoulder and having smaller lots and tighter housing and higher rent. But what we're talking about is a higher level of diversity, a higher level of transience, people coming in and people going out. We're talking about a high level of trauma, the hurts people experience collectively and individually as rents are high, as people come and go, right? We're talking about, as I mentioned before, the spiritual pluralism that can exist, the skepticism of institutions, and even relational fragmentation that it can exist in places where there's lots of us and we're coming and going. Maybe we don't have the long-term relationships that might be available in places where that's not the case, right? I imagine many of us have bemoaned some of these things in our lives here in the Bay Area, right? As you watch people move in and move out, as maybe you don't speak the same language as your neighbors that you wish you could really connect with and you just can't, right? So what we're talking about as disciples, when we talk about being gospel-centric people and trying to share that in those settings, what we're talking about is trying to go across cultures. We're talking about trying to navigate complex, dense, and often broken social ecosystems where trust is really low and people's survival instincts are sort of in overdrive, right? Everybody's kind of grinding just to get through it, right? To make rent, to get through traffic, to buy their groceries, to hang out with that one friend they feel like they have, right? This is a challenging environment to share the gospel. It's always challenging to share the gospel because that requires faith. It requires courage and stepping outside of yourself on some level. But maybe we might say it's a little even harder. It requires a little more intentionality and courage in a setting like that. So that's what I want to talk about. And if that resonates with you, if that's been your experience in the Bay Area, hopefully as this unfolds, we can at least give ourselves some frameworks to work through what it is we need to be thinking about, feeling, and sort of purposing to do with that. My experience in San Francisco is kind of the opposite of what I described in Atlanta, where you have these like pseudo-spiritual Christian street prophet types. In San Francisco, largely, it's the inverse, where maybe you get the occasional argumentative atheist, but more often you get sort of a free-floating spirituality that isn't necessarily Christian in its ideology or vocabulary. And sometimes it's even hard to figure out what exactly it is. It just kind of is. It's a lot of loose ideas that sort of have been grabbed onto. And they're not really pseudo-Christian, it's sort of post-everything. It's kind of beyond all that, right? Nameless. And so as Atlanta taught me one thing, and that was maybe to cut through the familiarity, San Francisco has taught me to not assume any shared ground. I don't say that to be pessimistic. It's just an observation that maybe one of the first things that we can start doing individually and as groups of people is helping each other ask good questions. As you get to know your neighbor, as you bump into that person in the grocery store, as you work in that office space next to your coworker, maybe you've had this experience. Maybe you've had an opportunity to ask questions and get to know somebody. You know, you do all the small talk stuff like, when did you move here? How long you been here? Where do you work? Right? In those conversations, those are questions. And in a way, they're good questions. But inside of you as a Christian, as a disciple, as you seek occasion to build relationship and to understand someone on a deeper level, make no assumptions about their spiritual life. That was a hard lesson for me coming from Atlanta. You know, maybe in Atlanta it looked like this. Where do you go to church? That doesn't work in San Francisco, right? All you guys are going, you dummy. Why were you asking questions like that? You don't know what you don't know, right? Until you try. And that was one of the things I learned very quickly. You don't ask questions like that. Maybe you ask a question instead of like, hey, where do you go to church? You maybe say something like, are you a spiritual person? What does that look like for you? How do you practice that, right? Maybe you've had conversations like that here in the Bay Area. And so maybe so far, everything that I've said, you guys are like, we got that. We're already doing that, dude. We're way ahead of you. And that would make me happy to hear that. I'm going to skip over the part of my outline that establishes the need for evangelism, because again, I think you guys know that, but there is something that I want to say that comes on the tail end of that, and that is about like the biblical model of evangelism. And I'm going to throw this to you guys as a generalization. I think you can find some exception to this in Scripture, but I think you're going to find that this is largely how it works. For instance, using Paul in the book of Acts, think about this. Paul often is present in a place for some amount of time when he begins making proclamations about the gospel, sharing things. What we just read in Acts chapter 17 may be sort of an exception to this, where maybe he was there for a very short amount of time before what we're reading in Acts 17. We don't really know for sure, but I would suggest to you that Paul has this pattern where he goes to a place, sort of establishes his presence in a tighter community before widening his net to a larger community. There's lots of reasons for that potentially. Maybe the Jew-Gentile progression, Jews first, Gentiles later, is a part of that. But I also think in God's wisdom that what we can learn from that is it's often very useful for us, if we're going to be people who share the gospel in our sort of urban contexts, to be present in those places. What I mean by this is the types of people we do not tend to be drawn to I'll speak for myself, the kind of person I do not tend to be drawn to are people that like swoop in, tell you how things should be, and then vacate. Have you had people that like your work has brought in like that? Where work has said, we got this guy coming in, he's going to tell us all this stuff, and then they come in and tell you all this stuff, and then they bolt for wherever it is they're supposed to be next. You know what the talk about that person is in the workplace after that person's gone? Man, they're the worst. They don't know what they're talking about because X, Y, Z. They don't understand the situation at this place is A, B, C, D. Do we do that with the gospel? Do we like kind of swoop into somebody's neighborhood, into their life, start telling them how things are before we really understand what's going on? I would suggest to you that Paul has some measure of existing, having a presence in a place as he proclaims. He's there with those people, understanding them in their community, as he was in the synagogue and then the marketplace. Another principle I want us to explore here in a moment is that we would do well to follow the natural progression of that, to be forming relationships with people that precede any exhortation or rebuke we give. Right? That would come right on the heels of being present and proclaiming naturally. Sometimes we have to say, call a spade, right? You can't get around that. But the occasions where that tends to go best in our lives, maybe you've experienced this, are the occasions where you've really gotten to know someone, you've really worked alongside them in some level, and then arises an opportunity to challenge, to push, to grow. And then you have some context. Imagine being that person. That person has some context for receiving what it is you're sharing with them, right? Because there's goodwill. There's camaraderie. There's an understanding that can exist there. And I think we see Paul demonstrate that in some capacity through the book of Acts. And with this comes an understanding, a contextualization of a person and their situation. The things they might mean when they say this or that, right? We can actually hear what they mean rather than sometimes the words they're saying, right? Because we know them, we're familiar with them, we know where they're coming from, we know where they work, we know what they go through in a day, right? We know who their kids are. We know that little Timmy's a handful, right? Thinking about my right now. We understand those things, so we can hear what they're saying, right? We hear what they mean when they say something. And so we have contextualization, we have an understanding, we have a presence, and then that leads us to gospel work of the boldness of a proclamation, right? It's in the face of that relationship, in that place, and in that context, where then we do not shy away, that we have the courage that God gives us to speak what needs to be spoken, but now we've facilitated an occasion, a relationship that gives that challenge its best chance of being heard how it's meant to be heard, which on our part should be, in truth, by love. Okay, so maybe think of it this way. If you're someone who hangs on to little quippy things, maybe this is helpful for you. Incarnation, proclamation, formation, in that order. Incarnation means something like, I am among them, I'm here, these are my people, right? Proclamation means I speak truth to them. I talk about things that matter, right? Here with my people. And then finally, formation, and I stay and I help build and strengthen these people. That's been a big help for me in the work that I've done through the years, and it's been what may seem very obvious to you guys was not as obvious to me, and I've had to learn these things over the years. It's a big part of why when I moved to San Francisco, in conversations for planning that, different people, as I met people here, I would come on visits. Mike helped facilitate some of those. You guys have helped facilitate those in the early years. I would come and people would say, okay, I hear you, you think you're going to move to San Francisco, you want to try to help teach the gospel here. Where are you going to move to? Are you going to move to and then insert someplace. So you're like, oh, you're going to move to Marin. Marin's pretty nice. You can just kind of like commute into San Francisco, do your work, whatever. And a big part of why I said, no, I'm going to live in San Francisco was because I learned these lessons, right? I'm going to be in this place with these people. They're going to be my neighbors. My kids are going to be at their schools so that I can have these opportunities, right? At the annoying PTA meeting that you go to, or at the bus stop. Every day when that bus blows by without stopping, we can all groan together, right? And like these people know who you are. And in that way, you are one of them, they are one of you. And so when you start talking about something spiritual by faith and by courage, they know you're just in it with them. And they can hear what you have to say. Again, we all feel this. We all do this sort of thing, right? Okay, so that's a lot of me talking up front. I wanted to present, at least in broad strokes, some of categorically what I want to talk about more specifically today. And so with the last little bit here, I want us to think, and maybe we can have some conversation about this. Where have you seen your presence open doors for the gospel that merely just preaching and talking would not have done? Can you think about that? I'll give you a moment to think about it. And if you think of something that you want to share, I would love to hear it. So is there an occasion that you can think of like, hey, just being around opened a door that me just saying some things would not have opened? When I ask myself this question, it's hard to conjure up things, but when I thought about it for a long time, eventually they started flooding into my mind. I imagine a lot of us are like that. Go ahead, Mike.
I'll give a couple of examples. One would be when my first wife had cancer in an infusion room in which you have a lot of people that have the same problem. Secondly, when my kids were growing up, on a softball field, both of my daughters played softball. You'd mingle with the other parents, get to know them, get to know a little bit about their background. They find out where I work, what I do, and then it leads to conversation.
Okay, that's great. Thanks, Samuel, for the assist there. Look, man, opportunities because he was here to do something that if he was not here, he would not have been able to do. Anyone else? Yeah, go ahead.
I talked a lot about God, but then I shared my life experiences with my grandkids and such. And I noticed over the years a lot of people. When I started it, it wasn't very many people talking about the Lord and Christ on Facebook, And then a lot of people got on and really want to spread the good news.
Okay, thanks for sharing that. You know, in the digital age, proximity is a funny thing. And I think that's a great example of like a form of proximity, right? In my mind, I was thinking about like being in my neighborhood, walking the streets and rubbing elbows with people and the opportunities that would present itself. But the same can principally apply to the digital tools that are available to us, right? So yeah, that's an interesting application. Thank you for sharing that. Anyone else?
Being there also gives us the opportunity to be to show the difference um, just by some of the choices we would make. Samuel and I would go to camps, and some of the choices we would make in scout camp or other places we would go with others would cause questions. And it was not that we were overtly looking to generate those questions, but just because of the fact we were there and doing something different.
Yeah, thanks for that. So proximity can build trust in a way that we can't necessarily without that, right? People trust familiarity before they trust theology. And I think we all maybe understand that implicitly, but maybe we've never thought about it explicitly. But it's true. Like, that's the reason why I joke with my wife about this all the time. So my wife is from Mississippi. Her family still lives in Mississippi. They live like 20 minutes outside of a college town in Mississippi, which is already, it's like 20,000 people, and they're 20 minutes out of that town. So they have some acres, and they live out there, and they're just kind of like old school Mississippi people. And one of the things I always joke about with Kirby and it's such a small thing, is how do most of us determine the best possible purchase that we're trying to make? What do? Like, you decide you want to buy a car, or you want to buy a TV, or you want some sneakers or whatever. Where do you go to find that information? All right, best 55-inch TV at this price point, and you read all the reviews and you make your choice, right? Who have you talked to in that process? But you know how my wife's parents do it? Well, my brother bought this TV, and he says that it's the best TV. And you know what? They all have that TV, right? You know what? When we go to Mississippi, they're all wearing the same shoes in that family, because one person bought that shoes and they swore up and down about how great those shoes were. And so the whole family, what do they have? They all bought those shoes. We understand that by default, really, which is kind of Mississippi's in default here, right? By default, we're kind of that way. We trust familiarity before we trust theology, right? So this is important for us to understand, that if we're going to be brave disciples, that means we're going to exist some places intentionally that maybe we would not of ourselves choose to exist, solely for the sake of the opportunity of sharing the gospel. All right, so one other categorical thing that I want us to think about is this idea of proclamation-centered evangelism, which just really means trust. This is all sort of progressive, right? So we have proximity, and now we have this, which trust opens ears to truth. I have a question for you guys. What methods of proclamation, of trust building, have actually produced conversations, not merely reactions? Anybody with experiences on this? Things you've done that have built trust, that have produced real conversations, not merely reactions. We got a hand over here. Thanks, Ben.
Well, we took in a family member, a younger cousin. We had tiny kids. We put him in a room that, didn't really have room for him, but took him in anyway and had great conversation.
Okay, that's a great example that both proximity led to an opportunity to build trust. That's wonderful. Anyone else? You got the mic, man. It's all you.
I interviewed somebody, and then after the interview, had other conversations. He was a young guy going for his first job. Just had other conversations about being an adult and getting your first job and whatever. Then he did not choose to take the offer there, but met him at another company, and it's like, I remember you. You kind of, you know, um, you were kind and speaking to me and giving me like other information like that, and it was a chance to then talk a little bit more with him.
Yeah. So the opportunity that proximity can bring, when we also then follow that up with being honest and truthful, establishes credibility, right? And who knows what future opportunities exist when we are faithful in that way. Did I see someone over here? Go ahead.
I used to work construction, and one of my supervisors wasn't a Christian. And there's a certain level of trust that you have to have between two people just working construction, lifting heavy things. You need to trust that the other person is going to be there for you. And so we built this relationship that was based on trusting each other to be able to do the work correctly and effectively. And just through normal conversations, I was able to like bring in the fact that I am a Christian and that I go to church on every Sunday. And he's like, wow, every Sunday. I'm like, yeah. He's like, that's a large time commitment. I'm like, yeah, it is, but I really care about it. And so it was that level of trust that allowed me to actually have those conversations.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks for sharing that. I appreciate your honesty and conviction in sharing with your boss. That can be awkward sometimes. And there's another progression to this that I want to get to because I know I'm going to run myself out of time before too long, so I'm going to try to pace this well. So as we think about proximity and then we think about proclamation, then we can think about what I call here mission integration. And this is the idea that like service brings credibility, that you're not just saying things, but you're doing things, right? So like truth, for instance, when embodied with compassion and love, actually becomes credible, right? You're not just a browbeater. You're not just angry. You're not just coming at them, right? That sort of thing. So a question here is like a very similar question is where have you seen service open a door for truth that otherwise might not have opened? Go ahead.
I'm sure I've seen tons of people do this. So I just had a lot of things come into my head. My dad always used to try to invite people over, give people food if they needed, and that always made an opportunity. Recently, I've just been able to help my landlord out with a couple things, and that makes him much more receptive and opportunity for conversation. Yeah.
Okay, so like both your father going out of his way to be hospitable and you going out of your way out of no obligation to be kind to your landlord have both created opportunities that really in no realistic world have existed. That's great. Anyone else? Yeah, go ahead. Your husband sabotaged you. It's a great gag if he did that on purpose.
He did not. He's too sweet. We have some older members here who have needed some help over the last years. And so I've made a lot of phone calls and a lot of visits, and everyone assumes that I'm the daughter. Oh, you're the daughter. And I'm like, oh, no, I'm just a friend from church. And I've had many people say, oh, like they're very surprised that you're doing this advocating or visits for somebody that isn't blood related to you. And so I hope that it's definitely, they've, been very taken aback by that. So hopefully that's something that they will think about, that people are out there loving elderly people and helping them for no other reason besides that they're their church family. So
Yeah, that's really beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. So as we think about these categories of like these principles as they sort of snowball and build on one another, the last one that I want to present is what I've titled discipleship-oriented evangelism. The idea that like repeated exposure and proclamation and service are actually going to facilitate long-term change. The idea that those are the things that actually make a disciple, right? And I think if we sit here and actually contemplate this, it makes a lot of sense, right? As you live in a place and as you talk to those people and you do things with and for the people that you are around and that you're talking to, not only is credibility being gained, not only is understanding, but there's a real fellowship that comes in that. And if through that process you're faithful and courageous to represent the gospel, what has this person already had put in front of them that a lot of people who have the gospel shared with them have not had put before them? A model of life here. What their faith could look like in this place, right? one of the downfalls, and I think like what Paul does is godly and necessary. He's traveling to a lot of places, but one of the pitfalls that he had to overcome is he didn't stay in those places, right? Not often for very long. Some places for more time, less time. And so what was probably a challenge, and we see this mitigated in Scripture through various tactics and emphases, is they needed models. They needed people who are going to be there with them day in and day out, showing them what discipleship looked like in places like Athens at the marketplace, right? Or in Ephesus among the idols, or in Corinth in the division, right? And so, big part of what you guys can do here in the Bay, what I need to be doing in San Francisco, is sustaining proclamation and proximity, i.e., credibility, care over the long term, the medium to long term. Now, this is hard. Rent's high. Maybe family members are far away from here because you moved here for some reason or another, right? You may not even personally plan to be here forever. But I would suggest to you a couple of things. One, just because you don't see yourself someplace forever doesn't mean you live differently than you would if you were somewhere forever. That's a really hard thing to accept because it opens you up. It opens your heart, your emotions, your mind up to some things that you're kind of inclined not to open yourself up to if you know you're going to pull away at some point. Relationships, heartbreak. You're going to feel things that maybe you wouldn't have felt if you had just stayed a little more tightly bundled and kept things a little cleaner, right? But this is necessary if we are truly interested in making disciples where we are. We have to open up our lives. We have to open up our hearts. We have to open up our homes. And maybe you're only here for 2, 5, 10 years instead of 20, 30, 40. But you got to live like you're going to be there for 20, 30, 40, not to dupe anybody, but because people need models of what life looks like here and how to deal with the challenges that are present here as a believer. How do we talk about God here? How do we think about God in the rhythm of life here? And so with that, the questions that come to my mind is how do you keep people around after conversations or after even conversion? What's worked? What hasn't? What do you guys think? Have you had these experiences? Do you have anything to share? How do we facilitate true discipleship? Go ahead.
I think a part of that's the relational aspect. I mean, I'm not just trying to convert you. I want to know you, and have some kind of relationship to build upon. Not only because it's effective, but because I care. Um, and I find that to be the most effective when it's not just me talking to you and like the street prophet just saying whatever and then that's all I hear, but actually building a relationship to care for you.
Amen. Yeah.
There's a maybe I should term it an intensity of engagement, right? The even if it is a short time, and you're not looking at it from the perspective of time frame, but you're looking at it as whatever time you have, there is that intensity of that engagement. There is a depth, and very often you will find that if you have an God-driven, intense, loving engagement that transcends even when you move to different places or you go away, especially in this day and age where everyone's but like a video call away or whatever. So it's, I think, um, important for at least us to think about that depth and intensity of engagement no matter the time frame.
Yeah. Well said. Well said. I'm going to move through this quickly because I realize I'm pretty much out of time here. So I'm going to conclude with a summation of the last couple points I have on my outline that I think are the most helpful. So there's a lot of realities that are at consideration in places like San Jose, San Francisco, and these urban, densely populated, multicultural, worldly places. We've already mentioned some of this, the spiritual pluralism that exists, the hyperdiversity that can exist. We didn't talk much about this, but I know this is true in San Francisco, sort of the performative activism that can exist, that every cause is a world-changing, most important cause, but we have 37 of them. Those come from things that are of God's image. I think that's important for us to understand. We might be misaligned about what is important, but that impulse that people have that's generating that stuff is God-given. I have to remind myself of that because sometimes, probably like a lot of us, we might eye roll at this or that, and we might get frustrated about this or that, right? But in remembering that, there's an important application that I think has really helped me. And it's so simple, but it's important to just kind of say and acknowledge and wrap our heads around that we can't change our culture by just condemning it, that we actually have to model a better kingdom. It's real easy, and I'm guilty of this with all of us, it's real easy to say, well, the problems are this, that, and the other. If people would just say, do, and think this, we'd all be sorted out, right? But the reality is we don't actually believe that, not really, because when Jesus came to the earth, that's not really how he dealt with us. And we love him for that. Certainly he had things that he said like, hey, you got this wrong. Hey, you need to think like this. You really should be doing this. But the most important things about Jesus, the reason we all love him, is because he said, I'm going to be here with you. I'm going to tell you the truth, and I'm going to help you do it, and I'm going to show you the way, right? Philippians chapter 2 makes the point that no one's ever been more humiliated than Jesus, right? He came from heaven just to be here in our neighborhood, right? And so if we can embody that Christ-like mentality that we don't fix things merely by condemning how they are, but actually by exemplifying the better kingdom of Jesus. And so I think in some of the ways we've talked about, some of the ways you guys have shared and observed, we can begin doing that. When we rub elbows with the people that we're hoping to help and encourage and be encouraged by, when we're proclaiming what needs to be proclaimed, when we're serving in ways that we ought to be serving, and we do that in the mentality and in the mode of medium to long term. That we're not transients ourselves, even if that may be the plan. Even if life swerves and that ends up being what happens to us, we don't treat our places, our people, our neighborhoods as transactional. That we see them as in the image of God and worthy of our care and our effort. So I had some closing discussion questions that I'm out of time for, but we are not strategists. I've been a part of a lot of like strategy meetings on outreach and things, and I'm not knocking that stuff. It's important to be thoughtful and considerate and use our resources well and organize. Those things are very helpful. But that is not who we are. We're not strategists. We're missionaries. We're not like marketers. We're just messengers. We're not activists, but we are ambassadors. And we're not performers, but we are meant to be servants. And so as we think about San Jose, San Francisco, the people back in Atlanta that are thinking about Atlanta, or wherever it is we may find ourselves, it's not about mastering methods. I think that's one really important takeaway. It's not about doing everything just right, having the right marketing and all that stuff, but it's about embodying Christ in hard places, speaking the truth in love, and staying long enough to demonstrate the transformation that the kingdom can give people and walking them through that. So thank you guys for letting me talk about this with you. I hope it was helpful. A lot of this may be sort of a no-brainer to many of you here. But if nothing else, just know if all of this is exactly how you're thinking, then we're on the same page. And we just have to encourage each other to stick with it and do the hard work of the day in and day out faithfulness of consistency and diligence and not getting cold. It's really easy to just start shutting off. It's really easy to just get through your day and get out of the car and just get in the door and just try to like block it all out. But that can't be how we operate. So thank you guys for listening. I hope this was helpful. It's a little uncanny way to end. It's not really an invitation. But certainly, this is the occasion that you guys know if there are prayer requests, if there are things that you guys need related to evangelism or otherwise, you see spiritual deficits in your life, this is the group of people you want to be sharing that stuff with. And this is the time, now is the only time that God has promised us. So take advantage of this occasion to make those needs known. Thank you guys.